Thank you, everyone, for being here. And also a big thank you to Experio for this opportunity to talk about a book that I co-authored recently. And also, I'd like to thank Experio for hosting seminars or having seminars with this kind of format that gives you an opportunity to talk about something that you're passionate about and something that maybe you get to choose what to talk about. That's not always the case in my line of work, at least. So the topic today is the materials of service design, making sense of a material mix. So that is what we will be trying to do during the coming hour and a few minutes. I am Johan Blomkvist. I work at Linköping University. I have a background in cognitive science and studied cognitive science. And in cognitive science, the main questions revolve around human thinking and how humans relate to the world socially and through the artifacts that we interact with. And after some time working within cognitive science or studying cognitive science, I sort of found a track with more focus on design, interaction design, and service design. And that was really interesting for me. And I really I really could see a connection between making sense of how people think in situations and designing things with that background. And that led me into doing a PhD. And the thing that sort of motivated me to do a PhD was specifically the question of materiality. So I wanted to understand, what does it mean to do prototyping, design prototyping, when the material is so difficult to capture, difficult to understand, difficult to frame in a good way. So I knew from interaction design how to prototype a website, for instance, and I knew what that looked like, but I couldn't really understand or figure out a good way to frame what a service prototype would look like. So I didn't know that back then, but the problem that I had was actually with materiality. I didn't really know how to relate to service as a material. And of course, a lot have happened since then, but my thinking has not evolved enough to be able to answer that question in a very straightforward way. So that led me and to colleagues to write this book, The Materials of Service Design. And basically, it asks the same question. It questions whether design of service can be seen as a traditional design discipline, or what is different when we talk about service design in terms of the materiality. So a few questions that we had that we pose in the book are: if design is about forming materials, then what are the materials of service design? What is it that we're forming? What is it that we're shaping as part of a service design process? And another way to frame that perhaps is what something is designed as part of service design. Like, what is it that we're doing? What is the end result of a service design process? And I'm not the only one asking these questions. My co-authors were Simon Clatworthy and Stefan Holmlid. But we also had a lot of other co-authors in the book, because we arranged a symposium in 2021, I think, where we invited thinkers within service design in academia, but also in industry, to suggest materials. So we wanted them to say, what is the main material that we work with as service designers? What does it mean to design service with this material? And we wanted them to sort of sell this material to us. We wanted them to give a good pitch for why this material was central or very important, at least for designing services. And we then ended up including those material suggestions in the book. And we will have a look at some of them as we go along here. Yes, so the book asks a lot of questions, and I think those questions are very reasonable to ask of a design field. It's a sign, I think, of a maturing field to question the material, the foundational assumptions within a field, for instance. And also, I think for any design discipline, there is always an ongoing development, an ongoing debate, thinking, evolving idea about what the properties of the design material is. So I think it's good to ask this question, and it's good to keep asking the question. Yeah. So and another question that we ask then is if crafting traditional materials give physically a direct feedback that is evident in the crafted object, can we identify similar patterns in services? And what would that look like then? What is feedback, direct feedback, and what can be evident in the crafted object for service design? So a lot of questions, and if you are expecting me to give a straight answer to that, unfortunately, I will have to disappoint you, because we don't do that really in the book, but we do give some tools for thinking about materiality, and we give some directions and maybe further questions that might be useful when thinking about what designing service means. And one of the interesting things, I think, service design is still a young field, so we don't really know. No one really knows what the material is or what it will be. And as we work with service design, as we learn about service design, and as we do things within the service design framework, we also define what the material is. Like we lay claim to some aspects of designing services. So this is something that is evolving, and it's very important, I think, to think about what that means. Okay, so the book has 4 parts. Each part is represented by one of the tools here on the front page of the book. The first one is something made the object of study, which is the introduction part of the book. And then we have the constituents of which something is composed, which is the material library. So the submitted materials from different authors ended up being a library of materials that we have in the book. So that's the second part of the book. The third part is qualities by which something may be categorized, which is going to be the bulk of the presentation that I do today. And this is the part where we look at all the materials that were submitted to us, and we try to make sense of them. We try to understand. So what does it mean that these materials are suggested as being central or important within service design? And then finally, a performance repertoire is the final part of the book, which I won't go into very much in this presentation. And this means that the structure of the talk will be as follows. I will start by talking about some of the materials. I will talk about materiality of service. And then we will go into some assumptions about materiality and what it means to understand service as a material and what we can transfer from other materials to service as a material. And then we will sort of look at the next part of the book, which is where we talk about service as a hypermaterial. And that is where we sort of we take another round of analysis around the materials, and we sort of abstract away from that one additional step and think about, okay, so what does that mean for designing service? And then at the end, I will try to suggest a few ways to make sense of the materials by categorizing them and by suggesting a framework where materials can be placed and a way to sort of make sense and maybe learn from the long list of materials that we have in the book. That was a very long introduction. And by the way, if there are any questions along the way, I hope that I can get some help from Kalle or Jonas or someone else to have a look at chat and just let me know if something pops up.
Absolutely. We'll
Perfect.
have an eye in the chat.
Perfect. I will also ask you to give suggestions for materials, for new materials that are missing from the list. And since you don't really know what materials we have in the book, probably, I will show you the list now in this very slow and meditative way. So these are the materials in the current material library in the book. And of course, we invite feedback and suggestions to this, but today I would just like you to contribute to this list by adding your suggestions for materials. And you don't have to do that now. I will give you a few minutes, in a few minutes to do that. So this is the full list of materials that we have in the book, suggested as central or important, at least, for service design. And I think some of these materials will make a lot of sense, and some maybe make less sense when you first see them. So I picked out the ones that I think maybe you could struggle a little bit more with understanding why they are included here or what they actually mean. So I will talk a little bit about them. Maybe you'd like me to talk about other materials, but then you have to contact me separately, because we don't really have time to go through all of these. All the materials are really interesting, I think, and they really add their own flavor, their own kind of version of what service design is and what we need to be aware of when working with service as a material. And I will explain then the social structures material, time, organizations, certainty, data, matters, clay, and human bodies, because like I said, I think those maybe are a little bit more surprising than the others. So first of all, social structures. This is a material that was submitted by Jusina Vink and Kaisa Koskela-Huhtari. And social structures are basically entrenched patterns in our social activities. And those patterns guide people in the actions that people take and in the interactions with other human beings. So that's the material, and there's also some suggestion for what this material consists of. So you can see three of the things then that they consist of in this image of social structures in a family. So there's roles, norms, beliefs. There's also rules and values. And that's sort of, those are the building blocks of social structures. And this is a really interesting material, I think. I think the best way to understand it and to see how to work with this as a material is to read the chapter, of course. But that's my short introduction of that material. Then we have time. This material was suggested by Stefan Holmlid, one of the authors of the book as well. And Stefan talks about time in a way that makes it a little bit well, I think he opens up a lot of questions about time and how time can be introduced and understood in service. And he distinguishes between different ways in which we design time. So one of them is timing. So we think about when something happens in a sequence of events, for instance. But there's also timing, so creating those times. And maybe, I don't know exactly what Stefan meant. Maybe he should tell us about this at some point. But also, working with time from the perspective of creating something at the right time. So making sure that something happens in the service in the right, not only sequence, but also in the right time when it's opportune. And Stefan includes two concepts of time here. He talks about chronos time, which is normal chronological time. And he talks about kairos time, which is more of an opportune or right time for something to happen. Yeah, in this material, I think he illustrates how kairos as a concept can really give possibilities to work with time as a design material. So that's also really interesting and perhaps a little bit surprising as a central material for service design. Another one is organization, maybe not so surprising, but I'd like to show this anyway. This is from Olivia Harre and Lena Nielsen, and they basically say that the organization is the design material in service design, but they say that the way that the organization is designed is through the artifacts. And in their chapter, they talk about the different representations of organization or of service that are produced by different actors in a service, different stakeholders. And they give this example, these three examples here of what the organization stakeholder perspectives, and they say that service representations, service design representations of service are distinct, are different than the other disciplines, the managers or HR or whatever. Their idea of organization is different. So that's also interesting, I think. And then we have certainty. This one is suggested by Thea Snow. And certainty is a material that is created by artifacts. So certainty comes from physical constructs that are created to achieve a sense of control. These physical constructs, then, they give structure, they provide scaffolding to understand an organization or a service then. And the thing is with these certainty artifacts that they are not trying to resolve the uncertainty. They are trying to the underlying uncertainty within the situation, because a design situation is always uncertain. So I think that's a very interesting point of view of this. And she also points to the problem when these artifacts sort of become the truth. So we create something to make sense of a situation, but that thing then is not actually the service. It's not reality. And she says that these certainty artifacts should never be sort of confused with actual reality. So that is also, of course, interesting. All of these are interesting. I don't have to say that for everyone, I think. And then we have data matter. As data becomes matter, design matters. This one was submitted by Peter Falk. And data here meaning basically material that is produced by abstracting our life and our worlds. And then institutions take actions based on data about humans, the abstracted data about our lives. And then the question becomes, what does the data represent? like how are we represented to institutions that make decisions about our lives, for instance. I think this is really interesting for public sector, and I really like Petter's work on this. And then we have clay, and this is one that we talked a lot about, if it's even can be understood as a material of service design. And this was submitted by Matilda Legeby, and basically she shows how clay that is used by participants to express elements of their experiences, express elements of their experienced life. Yeah, how clay is used and how clay can be a catalyst and a way to capture experiences. And yeah, I think that that is my understanding of this material, and I think it's really interesting, and it's sort of become an indicator of how broad the material of service can be seen to be. So clay is sort of categorized or understood then as a tangible catalyst within design, and that has ramifications for what happens also later in the chapter that I'm going to talk about, and how we understand service as a material. And then the last one is human bodies, and it's quite literally human bodies that is the material, and this one was submitted by Fernando Secomandi and Fredrik van Amstel. And they base their material on a phenomenological analysis of service, and they look at bodies specifically as part of interface, as part of when they interact with the service. So how bodies then mediate interactions or exchanges within a service. Yes. All right. So those are the materials that I wanted to highlight, and this is the full list of materials. I would like now to take just a few minutes where you can add your own suggestions to the list of materials. It's okay if you don't have a suggestion, that's fine. But I will write the question in chat if I can do that. So we have observation, critical thinking, metaphors, which also someone else liked, heuristics. There's a question mark. Creativity, innovations, Legos, or other things similar to clay, I think. Yeah, Post-its. We used them along the way. Yeah, that's a good one. Something exploring the concept as a material for service design would be interesting. Scripts, contradictions, innovations. Great. The affection of soon to come, ongoing exploring. Wow. That is a great one. Power, yes, power. We talk about power in the book. I think that was a little bit, at least, to some extent. That was submitted by one of the industry authors. Knitting work, yes. Oh, so many good contributions there and suggestions. Thank you all very much for that. So I will definitely take a look at that list, and you can keep adding materials as we go along if you want to. I also wanted to acknowledge, of course, all of the authors of the book. It's not just me, Stefan, and Simon who wrote, like I said. So this is the complete list of contributing authors, except for me and Stefan and Simon. So thank you very much. to these people. I think some of them are here. I hope some of them are here at least. So let's go on then and look at some of the assumptions about materiality. So this is when we, in the third part of the book, look at the materials and try to make sense of what they mean, why they are there, how they relate to each other, and things like that, and what it means to design those materials then. So there is definitely a duality within service. Service is something that has been thought of and said to be immaterial. In the beginning of service design, my service design journey at least, a lot of people used to say that service is the thing that you can't drop on your foot. So, you know, it's what products are not, for instance. But that has sort of evolved, I think, and the view now is that service is more of a mix of physical and non-physical elements, and that we think of all of that as service, not just the immaterial elements of it. In the book, of course, we discuss the meaning of materiality and what happens when we think about service as a whole, as a material then. And one of the things that we can say based on assumptions about materiality in itself is that if something is material, it also has importance. That's part of the meaning of the word material. Something is material if it is important. And maybe there has been this kind of skewed evaluation of the material of service towards products, because we're used to working with products. Traditional design disciplines work a lot of times with products. And also we tend to believe something that is material. We tend to put more, well, faith in something that we can look at, that something that we can actually see. So that is one aspect of this duality of services, that the material maybe is more emphasized than the immaterial, at least traditionally. On the other hand, materials also have this negative connotation for sustainability, and that something that is material also is something that leads to waste a lot of the time, and it creates a lot of waste. And maybe the first then reflection relating to services and material as described in the book is, what does that mean for the materials in the book? What is waste in this context? If we think about service as not only physical, but also the non-physical elements of service. And in some disciplines, they know what waste in service is, and it often has to do with efficiency. We want to make sure we don't have any delays, any duplication errors, any inventory issues, any logistic issues, or anything like that. But maybe there's also waste in terms of more human elements of services. And maybe there are analogies to waste. The more service we make, maybe the more waste we get out of that. And how do we deal with that? I think those are questions that comes from this, from looking at materiality specifically as a concept, and service and the materials that we have in the book. And another thing that you might assume then, based on the material and immaterial duality, is that materials we can run out of materials. The material things will have an end at some point. But maybe then we assume that the immaterial things could not run out. We could not run out of politeness, for instance, in a service. But I think that's an error of thought, because I think also human resources can be depleted or exhausted, or just, you know, worn down as a service is delivered, day after day, week after week, year after year, and so on. So the behavior within a service, I think, can deteriorate, for instance, and the patience of the service can deteriorate, much like, you know, deterioration happens when you use a material object over and over again. And the experience of the service can then also, of course, deteriorate in a similar fashion. And there is this really appealing way to look at design that I just want to mention. And this is something that Thomas Edman have said a long time ago, designing as keeping house or economizing, which in Swedish would be hushålla with human resources. So thinking of design as, you know, economizing with the human resources and making sure that the humans within a service is not depleted, or their emotions are not depleted. We talk a lot about emotional work in services nowadays. So I think that's an interesting way to see this and to think about this from a material standpoint. We also keep talking about these assumptions and think about materiality as the concept then, and ask questions about what do we assume about materiality. And one of the things, or some of the things that we assume about materials, is that we can see materials, we can touch materials, materials will have weight, firmness, malleability, buoyancy, or whatever it is. They have these assumed qualities, a lot of times at least, when we talk about materials. And if we frame service as a material, as I've done here, then maybe that gives access to some of those qualities. I say give access, but maybe it just confuses the image. But we talk a little bit about what can be learned from that, or how we can start to think about services in another way then. So I just compared two of these. So we compared one of the properties of materials, weight in this time, with time, for instance. So what does weight of time mean in a service? How can we use that? How can we understand time as having weight in a service? And what does that do for designing time within a service? And we don't answer that question in the book. That was something I came up with when I created this presentation. And then I just added firmness and behavior. That's also maybe an interesting combination of these qualities and materials. Malleability is something being easy to physically manipulate. Maybe that's actually just the opposite of firmness to some degree. But if we think about that and culture, and maybe that's not so evocative, but I think these are quite evocative. It's interesting to think about the materials from the perspective of very physical material domains and think about how that can be related, transferred, or something like that. So maybe this is more of the beginning of a design tool or something like that, to think about the materials, the service materials from more of a traditional material perspective. And we can also think about what happens to another material that we have in the book, thinking. What happens if we think about thinking as a physical material, having those qualities, or certainty, or any of the other ones? I think that that's really evocative, to me at least, to think about. Yeah, so continuing on this idea of tangible material properties, some of the materials that have been suggested are physical materials, or tangible materials at least. Clay is tangible. It can be warm, cold. It can be wet or dry, soft or hard, and so on. We also have sound that has loudness, pitch, timbre, duration. Yeah, there are qualities to these materials that, you know, that we already have in the book, of course. And one of the things that we started thinking about then is that how predictable the outcome of actions are on the materials. So if we work with clay, we have some control and some ability to foresee what happens if we do something. When clay is still malleable, when it's still wet, we can shape it in different ways. We can use our hands to shape it. And shaping that means that we can directly see what happens to the material. We can also foresee what's going to happen. If I push really hard, then something will happen to this piece of clay that I have. When it's dry, we can drop it on the floor and it will probably crack. The actions are foreseeable. But when it comes to the other materials, the actions or the outcomes of the actions that we take are much more distant and much more difficult to predict. So predictability sort of increases as materials get more and more intangible or more and more abstract or metaphysical to us. So that was one of the reflections that we had. There's also, of course, when we look at the materials, some types of interplay between the different materials. So certainty, for instance, and conversations are coupled with and influenced by physical artifacts. That's something stated in those chapters and descriptions of the materials. There's a close connection between our feeling of certainty and the artifacts that we create. And the conversations are shaped by and informed by the artifacts that are created. And physical artifacts can, of course, have a perceivable impact on other materials. So it's not so foreign for us to think that, you know, this material might leave an imprint on the other material. But there's also, of course, the reverse situation where the intangible materials impact other materials in different ways. And this can be seen in material practices and cultures and in material expressions and things like that. One example here is how clay is used to illustrate the experiences of people in co-design processes. So expressions of the inner world of the intangible inner world of participants leave impressions in the clay in this instance. So clay can be used to express something, and that way we can also see that intangible materials influence the physical materials. And that was an interesting insight and an interesting way of thinking of what actually goes on when we work with these catalyst materials. Another concept is resistance. So we know that there is resistance in physical materials. Depending on what the material is, you have to push harder or softer to make that material change somehow. And maybe that's called firmness then, like something that resists change is maybe a little bit more firm. But what does that mean for the intangible materials then? So resistance is maybe more of a suitable term for service materials, since they also have an intangible component. And we talk a little bit about how to think about resistance in service, and we think that one of the things is that it's not evenly distributed in the service. It depends on what element of service you look at or on what material you look at. So rules, regulations, policy perhaps has quite high resistance. It's difficult to influence that element of service. To change the rules and the regulations for what you're able to do within a service is resistance, high resistance. Attitudes, relationships, organizational boundaries, for instance, maybe have a little bit less resistance. Maybe it's easier to influence those elements of materials, and so on and so forth. And I mean, this is something that you can think about your own organization or your own practice or your own design project. What can we change? How high is the resistance on these levels? And this is not only, of course, happening on the organizational level, it also happens on the individual level. So resistance will change depending on what your current openness to change is. And to identify resistance in service, there's different materials that we can use. We can use conversations, rituals, bodies, behavior to understand what the current resistance of a service is at the moment. And we also suggest that based on the materials that we have received, we can say something about service as a material on a broader level. So service has cognition, behavior, and mood. That's a claim that we make in the book. Cognition of a service is emergent and may be observable from the processes within the service. It can be identified in the symbols, the signs, and the artifacts. It is expressed by humans, bodies, clothes, different physical artifacts of the service. It's the way that we try to figure out what the service wants us to do and how to behave in the service. Service itself has behavior. The behavior is the manifestation of the personality of a service, how we want the service to be. And this is something that we talked about earlier that can be sort of degraded with time, for instance. It varies between and within service providers. The behavior is not consistent if we assume that human beings are part of service. And changes to service can be influenced by the mood of a service. And mood then is the final one. So the service mood definitely influences, for instance, the resistance to change. So if the workforce is under threat of layoffs, for instance, how does that influence the mood of the service? That influences, like I said, change willingness, trust, openness. It depends, and it will illustrate to customers how the service is doing at the moment through the digital, well, to some extent, maybe the digital, but mainly the human expression of the service. And of course, the mood of a service also changes, with the time of day. So at some times of the day, a cafe will be more busy than other times. That will probably influence the mood of the service. If it's busy, if it's calm and things like that. But also as, cycles of the year and things like that changes, the mood will be different. It will be possible for someone to identify the mood by maybe doing a service safari or something to get a closer look at that. All right, so that's that part of the analysis that we did. So that was looking at the materials and trying to make sense of them, trying to make sense of them as material, and comparing them to this idea of materiality. And now we're sort of taking an additional step back from the materials, and we try to look a little bit more at the wider picture and try to understand what this mix actually means, this mix of materials. What does that mean for how we understand service as a material? And one of the features of service then is that it is hypermaterial, or it has hypermateriality, perhaps. And what hypermateriality means is that matter and form melt together with ever-changing immaterial elements. So there is a mix between these intangible, intangible, the duality that I talked about, and it melts together. It's difficult to make sense of where something starts and one and where it ends, and how they relate to each other, and so on. And properties of the material depend on what aspect you're looking at. So it's not necessarily defined by the materiality of the material in itself, but rather what aspect or element of the material you're interested in and what element you're looking at. And the sort of, if we assume that hypermateriality is a feature of service as a material, then representations become really important, because there are intangible, invisible elements of service then. And to understand them and make sense of them, we have to represent them. otherwise we're not able to form them. We can't form something based on just thinking about something. We have to make it something that we can work with. And representing here, I mean, in the widest sense of the word, but we had the example in the organizations chapter with how different disciplines visualize or represent service in different ways. And this is necessarily something that is done to understand where we are at the moment, where we're going, what are we trying to do, what are we trying to achieve with this service. And then representation becomes very, very central to the process of designing services. Maybe underestimatedly so. And there are some implications of this. One is that service design working with service design is partly work with an emergent human-made external representation of service. So some part of service design is to work with an understanding of service as something that has been made by humans as a representation of the material. And as we create those representations, service takes on virtuality, like elements of reality, but explained to us through the representations that we made or presented to us in the shape of representations. And we base, of course, design actions on that virtuality. We base our understanding and our decisions on how the service becomes alive through those representations that we work with in service design. And that is very important to be aware of. And of course, the opposite is if you're making a chair and you're chiseling the wood somehow, and you can actually see what happens to it. It's not a virtual situation. You're working with the actual piece of wood that you want to turn into a chair at the end. And this is not only true for service design, of course, that we work with virtuality this way. This is true for a lot of disciplines, but it's worth noting and it's worth taking into account and thinking about what that means when working with service design, I think. And that means also that the prototypes that we create, prototypes meant to be reacted to by people within a service, for instance, or customers of a service or whomever, becomes really vital, because as we add virtuality to our understanding or to our concept of what the service is, we need to verify that somehow. And the way to do that is, of course, to go back to the customers or the people within a service, the stakeholders, and show them, like, this is what we want to do in the service in the future. Do you agree with this? That's when we can start to reality check again and get back more to reality and get rid of some of the virtuality, perhaps. The virtuality can also be true, of course, or real representations, but I'll leave that for some more wine and evening. Yes. Another thing that comes with this hypermateriality is proxy materials. And proxy materials are really useful. Proxy materials are used to stand in for another material. We have the example here of a blueprint, a service blueprint. This is a virtual service. This represents the service. So it has taken on virtuality because it's based on reality and understanding of what the service is doing or could be doing. But it's not really reality, right? And yeah, as a proxy material, then we're able to start to rearrange things. We're able to work with service as a material through this proxy. And of course, when you're working with proxies, you need to be mindful of this gap then of virtuality between the reality and what you're representing. But proxy materials are really important for these kinds of situations. And there's also different ways in which we can manipulate reality through our proxy materials. So for instance, this is an illustration that we have in the book of how this relates to, how the materials relate to each other. So for instance, conversations that we create can have impact for thinking, and the thinking that goes on in a service can have impact on the organization that we're working within. And we can have direct manipulation of the conversations. We can create the conversation and decide what the conversation should be about. And then that can have an indirect influence on the thinking that goes on. But there's also this inferred manipulation that we're doing then in the organizations. So those are the ways in which we can actually influence with the proxy materials, other materials, and understanding these influences and these steps between the different materialities. That's really challenging, I think, in service design. We also have paramaterials. So paramaterials is something to maybe be a little mindful of because it could be a little bit harmful. So paramaterials are materials that behave like proper materials, but that actually aren't proper materials. What we mean by proper materials is maybe also a little bit difficult to define, but we use time as an example in the book. And we talk about how time is often represented like this. This is a customer journey process, and we can see different actors interacting with other actors. A and B interact, and then A and C, B and C, A and B. And time here is seen chronologically. I mean, we think that these events will happen like this, but we can also add other information to this to make it a little bit more substantiated, or to tell us a little bit more about what the actual time between these interactions are. And that might completely change the way we see what is going on in these situations. But we're still, just quantifying the time. We're not saying or learning anything about the experience of time. So this might be fine if it's about, fixing your car or something like that. But if it's waiting in line for healthcare, or for being informed whether or not your asylum, if you have if you've been allowed into a country, for instance, sorry, then it might be very different. The interpretation and the understanding and the experience of this time is very different from the actual representation that we have here. So that's something to be aware of. Some materials don't behave in the represented form the way that they actually do in service, and being able to figure out how that is different from the actual service is important, I think. Another element is that we need a lot of tools. Then we need to create tools. Some tools are ready-mades. The ready-made tools are forcing service into a predefined format, such as the service blueprint, where we have decided beforehand what is important to highlight with a service. So ready-mades, they can be templates, for instance. This is the template. But there's also another, and these are materials then that are used to shape other materials. Like I said, we create this to be able to shape another material. So a service blueprint, for instance, might be a material that we use to shape organization. And there is, of course, often possibilities in those ready-mades, in these tools, to do things that would not be possible to do in reality, or we might not be able to understand the consequences of our actions with the help of the tool. So for instance, if I move an interaction from, or I move a function of the service from the front line to the backstage, of a service, that might in turn lead to hundreds of layoffs in a service, for instance. That wouldn't be apparent. That wouldn't be something we could explore or examine using this tool. So the tools, of course, need to be used also with a lot of caution in service design, because they are just ways in which we can access service, but they don't tell the whole story. Another tool that we can use in design processes is everyday objects. We talk a little bit about that in the book. Everyday objects can influence to a very large degree, actually, what happens in service, and we have some examples of that. But I will leave that for someone who wants to read the book. Tool traces is also something that we talk about. And I asked the Copilot to create an image here that would show me a saw blade and some sawdust. And I don't know how that saw blade works, would work really, or what the flying hand is about. But yes, so tools leave traces in organizations in different ways. And I think this is also an interesting thought, an interesting conversation, because after service design has been part of an organization, it probably leaves sawdust traces in the form of, for instance, the language that is being used in the organization. So the organization might start to talk about customer journeys, they might start to talk about touch points or ecosystems or whatever it is that you're doing as a service designer. So that's one way we can sort of see the traces of using service design in an organization. Another way we can see perhaps traces is on the individual level. So if we include people from the organization in a desktop walkthrough or in a role play exercise, they might have an experience that gives them a new understanding of the service and maybe creates empathy for a specific situation or whatever it might be. And that individual insight then can lead to ideas or to values within a service. And those ideas and values, of course, can also be propagated throughout the organization. And maybe if the organization is able to pick up on those ideas and those values, then that is good. And that's maybe something that you could see as a trace of service design in an organization. If no one picks it up, or if there's no agency that allows those ideas and values to take hold in the organization, maybe then that is one way to think of waste, but on the intangible spectrum of service as a material. Yes. So those are the implications of hypermateriality. And I just need to double check. Do I have 10 minutes more, or are we finishing 20?
Yeah, 10 minutes more. It's 9:45.
Great. All right. So then we will move on to the final part here. Because, I mean, I think so far we're opening up a lot of discussions. We're opening up a lot of possible directions and ways to think and things like that. But it felt when we wrote the book also that we wanted to give something back. We wanted to create some kind of structure, something that people could feel like they actually got something out of reading this chapter. So we had all of these materials, and we started thinking about, so how can we make sense of that? How can we categorize them, or how can we make them into a structure that everyone can understand and maybe even to some point at least agree on? And that was a really big challenge when writing the book. But I will share a few of these attempts that we made. So this is the first one. This is based on new service development or concepts within new service development. So this is the concepts are system, process, and concept, where the system is basically the things that you have available to a service, the components, the things, the locations, everything that you need for processes to take place. So the preconditions for processes to take place. And the process consists then of actions, procedures, interactions, and things like that. So the things that develop or envelop in a service. And then the concept is kind of the value that is experienced from the process, and the experiences that are created in those processes and things like that. And this is a categorization that I've tried to do before, and so it was kind of easy to just try and take these concepts and then try to apply that to the materials in this book to try to make sense of them. And it was really difficult to do, and we didn't really manage to capture, I think, some of the materials, especially those that are used during design time, like the clay and certainty artifacts and things like that we use to achieve something during design of a service, for instance. Very difficult to categorize them in this framework. Time, thinking, collaborations, conversations, those also happen across all of these, so very difficult to place them. And of course, this conceptualization, the new service development conceptualization, is based on a service delivery perspective rather than a resource integration or a more up-to-date version of service and how we think about service. So that maybe makes this a little bit difficult to do, but I think still there is something to be said about this way of looking at the materials, and maybe it can be used as a high-level framework of some kind for service management or for service development even. But from a design perspective, I think it didn't really reach the full potential that it could have had. We tried another way of doing this, and we share this in the book, as you can see also. And this is based on a bottom-up approach where we take the materials and we examine the materials and we think about the materials from a design perspective and try to make sense of them based on the materials in themselves. So what are the materials and how do they relate to each other? And we came up with these this division then between the hands-on design, where we can actually have more of a direct manipulation, to an indirect manipulation or inferred manipulation stage. So yeah, this is another way to categorize it. I won't say too much about it. And what we ended up with, and this is maybe not, because we think that this is the correct way of doing it, but we think that this is the easiest way of doing it, or the way that makes most sense of making sense of the materials. So this framework has three main components to it. It's traditional designer competence, so where a designer can work on his or her own, can use traditional design knowledge to shape the material. And then all the way over to the right side, where we have designer facilitates co-design. So there's a co-design dimension to this. And then we have at the top, materials to catalyze co-design. And those three elements, I think, really open up the spectrum of the materials that we have in the book currently. And this model specifically is based on the materials that we have in the book. So it's very specific to that. So we tried then to distill those elements out of the framework and created this representation, which is of course much more easy to see and understand perhaps. So we think that these three sort of pillars or dimensions, end points of spectrums, should or could be included in in a framework to understand or make sense of the materials that have been submitted, or materials that are relevant for service design. And based on this, of course, you can also think about where each material would fit. It can be, placed in maybe the spectrum between two of the dimensions, or maybe like this, or maybe even using 3 dots, so you can place them on all of these sides of the triangle, perhaps. Or perhaps there's a way to illustrate how the material sort of the space that it occupies within this this representation. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I should also say that we are creating an online version of the material library. It shouldn't only be in the book, we think. So we are creating a web page, website for this library, and we will accept suggestions to that library. We will put up a template where you can suggest new materials, and we will try to look at them and give some feedback, and then build on this material library, because we think it's a really important thing to have. And that was all from me.